All right, well, good morning. You guys doing well today? Enjoying the summer and all the transitions that brings with the weather. And those of you with kids, your kids are back home, unless you found something else for them to do. So I know that's just a good change for families, a little bit different season here. A couple minutes here, we're going to be in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We're continuing in the 1 Thessalonians series. So if you want to turn over there, or you can wait a few minutes if you want, we're going to be there. And the goal of today's message is to hopefully be an encouragement. And that's a little bit tough for me. And let me try to explain why that is really quick before we pray and jump in. But this is probably about 2 or 3 years ago. I had to take a personality test at work. And I don't know if you guys have to do that at your job. I've had to do, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 of these now, to where you come out with a score in some, you come out with like an animal in others, like, you're the monkey of the group, and you're the raccoon or whatever. Well, anyway, so I had to do this personality test, and it ranked a whole bunch of different things. And it kind of came out with this little graph thing with like different dots that plotted, different traits and such. And so one of them was encouragement, right? And so I think I'm a decent person. I think I'm encouraging, right? Well, so I'm looking at all the dots, and there's like no dot on that line. And I'm like, okay, this thing must have messed up when it printed or whatever. And they're like, no, actually, you actually have to score on the chart for you to get a dot. So you are so unencouraging, you didn't even get a dot on the chart. And I'm like, okay, that kind of hurt. That wasn't very encouraging. It's the first sarcastic thought that I had back. So apparently I'm not a very encouraging person. I try, but I guess if you need encouragement, I don't know, go to somebody else first, come to me second. I don't know. No, in all seriousness, I'll try. The other thing I had going on this week, the other reason this may be tough for me, is I had soccer camp this week. I'm a school teacher, and of course we ended up the school year, and so I ran soccer camp. And this year I actually ran 2 soccer camps. I ran a soccer camp for a couple hours in the morning with little kids, first, second, third grade type age kids. Then in the afternoon I ran one for middle schoolers. Now, I had a good time. I like soccer, but at the same time, I think I used every encouraging word or phrase in my entire vocabulary this past week, right? Because you got this, little first grader who's really bad at soccer, but what you can't do is you can't look at the first grader and say, you're absolutely terrible, right? You have to come up with something encouraging, but at the same time, I didn't want to lie. Like, if it's a bad shot, I'm not going to be like, great shot, I'm not going to say that. So I did a lot of good try, good effort, good attitude, keep it up, So basically, I've burned through all my encouragement already. So I'm going to try today to encourage you guys from 1 Thessalonians 4. That's going to be one of the main ideas, and hopefully my personality and my lack of encouragement left in me today won't be a hindrance there. We want to be encouraged today. We want to be encouraged every Sunday, but specifically today, Paul's actually going to tell us, encourage people with these words. Hopefully that'll happen. Let me take a minute and pray, and then we'll jump into 1 Thessalonians 4 and talk about encouragement and resurrection today. But let's pray for a minute as we approach the word. God, I thank you for another morning to meet. I thank you for the first day of the week that we commemorate and we remember the fact that a couple thousand years ago, Jesus came out of a tomb on the first day of the week. And I thank you for that. I thank you for his life, his death, and his physical bodily resurrection, and for the truth that means in terms of the forgiveness of our sin and your acceptance of his sacrifice, but also, as we'll see, for the hope it gives us, that one day, even if we are to die on this earth, we will literally physically come back to be with you. And I thank you for that. I pray you'd help me today. I pray you'd help this to be an encouragement, not just because I'm saying lots of words up here, but I pray your word would be encouraging and your spirit would make it effective. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we're going to be in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and I've got kind of a bigger section today that we're going to try to take on as we go through the Thessalonians series. And my main idea, which a lot of times I build up to, but I'm just going to go ahead and tell you up front and then talk about it a little bit. The main idea I want to bring up today is the idea that the resurrection gives us hope. Okay, so if you want to write stuff down, you don't have to, but if you want to write stuff down, the resurrection gives us hope. Now, I have to admit, my Bible has little section headings over it, little italicized things that the editor put in, and that's actually what my Bible says over this block that we're going to look at in chapter 4. So I kind of ripped that one off, although I'll give the editor a little bit of credit here, all right? But I think they get it right. What's going to happen here in 1 Thessalonians 4, in a couple minutes here, we're going to start in verse 13, if you want to find the verse, is Paul is going to talk about the resurrection, but Paul specifically is going to talk about this in a hope-filled way. Okay, and we'll break that down some more as we jump in. So the big idea today in our Thessalonians series, we're talking about the resurrection and the fact that it gives us hope. Now, I think it's a little bit tough sometimes to kind of process and think through the resurrection. I've got a couple reasons for that, okay? One, when I say resurrection, I'm going to guarantee that a lot of you are thinking about a lot of different things. So I think one reason that it can be tough to talk about this is we have a lot of cultural confusion even about the term itself. Let me give you a little bit of a snapshot from my week and my study and such for this passage. One of the things that I do, I tend to do study at the kitchen table, which I don't know that my wife always really appreciates that when I have computer and books and everything out there. I like a big table. I'm not like a little desk person. I like a big table, right? So by virtue of the fact that we have a smaller apartment, I'm on the kitchen table doing this, my kids are running around, and a lot of times they'll ask me, what are you doing? What are you going to talk about? So I told my older son, Peter, I'm going to talk about resurrection. And he looks at me and he's like, oh yeah, like Plants vs. Zombies. And I'm like, okay. And fast time out if you're not plugged into that. It's like an app for kids where these like cartoon zombies come across. And it's like a strategy game. Okay, so if I get boring, you can download it. Or for some of you Candy Crush addicts that are too cheap to like buy it, buy the next Candy Crush thing and have to wait a couple hours, just play that one. All right, but the point of it is, if you haven't played that, here's the point. Peter's like, oh yeah, Plants vs. Zombies. And I'm like, not at all. But he's like, the zombies, they're like back from the dead. And I'm like, no, Peter, that's not it. All right, so we talked about that. On top of that, Peter's been reading some of the Harry Potter books, and he's been getting to the end and watching the film. And again, if you haven't seen Harry Potter, you don't have to know all of it to get through this. But at the end, Harry Potter's got this thing called a resurrection stone. Okay, it's a book about a magician and so on. So if you don't know about the story, that's fine. But so Peter's like, okay, so it's kind of like the stone that Harry Potter had to come back to life. And I'm like, well, that's actually closer, okay, but not quite, all right? Then, last sort of go-around I had with Peter, incidentally, all this week while I'm studying this, is we actually had the news on, just like the nightly news, or I think it was PBS News. And they were talking about Britain's vote to leave the European Union and all of that. And they were saying, okay, after the vote, there's sort of this buyer's remorse, and a lot of people want to re-vote. And they said, and by this point in time, Peter's been thinking about resurrection and so on, so he's ready to jump on this when they say this. He said, the newscaster said that there's this petition going around to have Britain re-vote on it, and maybe they can resurrect their hopes of being in the European Union. And Peter's like, resurrection. And I'm like, well, they use the word, Peter, but that's not what I'm talking about here. All right. So whether or not that makes any sense or not, I think that's just a little bit of a snapshot of some of the cultural confusion. When I say resurrection, that probably means a lot of different things, whether that's people coming back or a TV show you've seen. And I want to try to sort of cut through some of that and see it as Paul sees it, okay? So it's tough to talk about the resurrection because I think there's a lot of cultural confusion. Second reason I think it's tough to talk about it, and this is a little bit of the deeper end of the theological pool, so try to kind of stay with me here. I'll try not to take too much time on this, but try to think deeply for a moment. Second reason I think it's tough to talk about is when we come to Christians, evangelical Christians, I think often we define the idea of resurrection too narrowly, okay? I think we define it too narrowly. And I think what we often mean and what we often talk about or what we often think and process when we as Christians say resurrection is we think, okay, that means that a physical human body dies and physically comes back. And while I'm going to say that's true, I think biblically speaking that's too narrow. I think resurrection includes that, but I think it's a lot bigger than that. Now, we don't have a lot of time today to jump around to different passages, so I'm going to mention a few. I'm not going to read them, but I think you'll see this biblically speaking, that it's a much bigger idea. Right, resurrection in the Bible, if I had to sort of define it in the big picture sense, the doctrine of resurrection in the Bible is the idea that Jesus, through his life, his death, and his physical resurrection, but it's the idea that Jesus actually undoes all of the effects of sin on our world. Now, that includes your physical body dying. Guys, remember back in the garden, Genesis chapter 3, right? If you eat of the fruit, you're going to die. And we see that happen in the book of Genesis. You've got those chapters, Genesis 5, 6, where you've got the genealogy. You've got the refrain every time, right? Adam lived this many years, and he died. And, Seth lived this many years, and he died. And we see that happens. So the idea of resurrection, Jesus' resurrection, our resurrection, and such, all put together, it includes the fact that if you trust Jesus, one day you physically come back. That is absolutely true and wonderful, but it's much, much bigger than that. Again, I'm not going to take the time today because I got to keep going to get to Thessalonians, but I think a great place to go if you want to look at this more is to go to Romans chapter 8. Again, I'm not going to take time to jump in there, but in the middle part of Romans chapter 8, Paul is talking about resurrection and Jesus coming back and the children of God being revealed with new bodies. And Paul says all of creation, so not just you and me, but all of creation is groaning and waiting for that day. Why? Because all of creation is suffering. So when we talk about resurrection as Christians, I don't want to define it too narrowly. It does include your physical body coming back, but it includes the reversal of all of the effects of sin on the world. Or to state it positively, it's the fact that Jesus makes everything new. That includes you, but he makes everything new. So for instance, if we were to go to the end of the story, which again, we won't take time to do right now, but if you were to go to Revelation 21 to the end of the story, we find a new heaven and a new earth. And what we find right off the bat is John says, in this new heaven and in this new earth, there's no more crying. There's no more sickness. There's no more sadness. There's no more death. And then he lists out a bunch of types of sinful people, and he basically says there's no more sin. And essentially, that's resurrection big picture. Yes, it includes you and me if we know Jesus and new physical bodies in this city, but it also includes the idea that Jesus undid or got rid of or overcame, whatever word you want to use, all of the effects of sin. Now, that may have just sort of blown the sides out of your brain. So if that happened, okay, maybe just scratch down a note or two and come back to it later, but I think we define it too narrowly. It's bigger than we often think. Last reason I think it's tough to understand, and then we'll jump into 1 Thessalonians 4. The last reason I think it's tough for us as Christians to talk about and understand is I think not only do we define it too narrowly, like I just said, but we limit talking about the resurrection to a couple key times. Okay, the obvious one is Easter Sunday, right? If anybody gets up and preaches on an Easter Sunday and doesn't preach on the resurrection, I don't know, they should get like a little mini pastoral suspension or something. Like, you got to preach on the resurrection on Easter Sunday, right? You've got to do that. Even if you're in some epic sermon series, in the book of Job or something, you got to pause. You got to go to the resurrection on Easter Sunday, and that's good. Okay, the other time I think we hear a lot about resurrection and that idea is at the funeral of a Christian. And again, I think that's perfectly good and appropriate. To go to a John 11, where Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life. To go to a passage like we're going to see today, right? We don't have to grieve like those that don't have hope because we'll see them again. So I think we limit it to just those times, and we sort of miss out. Even as I prayed earlier, every time we gather on a Sunday, we're remembering Resurrection Day. We're remembering the day that God began to make everything new, and he started with Jesus Christ. He started with Christ coming from the tomb and undoing death for Jesus. Now, you may say, okay, does that mean we have to preach on resurrection every Sunday? Well, no, but sometimes I think it's a biblical theme we don't bring up enough. And what starts to happen then is we think, okay, resurrection's really good to talk about, in March or April of every year when Easter comes around. And resurrection's really great to talk about when a Christian dies, but we sort of lose its current significance and it becomes this thing that's only way far off. So, another illustration of sort of what I mean by that. Summer break for our kids, right? Summer break. And I think sometimes talking about the resurrection in terms of only far off and only in times when Christians die would be sort of like telling your kid when summer break comes up, hey, it's summer break, so next September you get to be in a new grade, and that's all we say. Well, that's true, right? Next September, assuming that they didn't get held back or something along those lines, they do get to be in a new grade, but there's all sorts of other stuff that's related to summer break in the here and now. We get to sleep in. We get to stay up late. Maybe we get to eat more junk food. Maybe we get to go to summer camp. Maybe we get to do swimming lessons or whatever it is. But there's a lot of current benefit and current things that we can see and enjoy related to the resurrection. Okay, so I think it's tough to talk about it by way of intro, and then we're going to jump in. But I think it's tough to talk about it because there's cultural confusion. Christians define it really narrowly, and we sort of limit the times that we talk about it. Now, I don't think that that's made all of us into a bunch of heretics that don't get the gospel right or anything like that, but I think if Paul says this doctrine should be a huge encouragement, and he does, and we either don't understand it or define it too narrowly or limit the number of times we talk about it, we're missing out on the encouragement of the resurrection. And that's what we don't want to do, all right? So one more time, the main idea today is that the resurrection gives us hope. And we're going to be in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. So if you're not there, you can flip over there, or you can look up at the screen up behind me. But we're going to be in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We're going to read a few verses and sort of look at how this works with the Thessalonians, and then we want to talk about how it works for us, okay? So we've been in Thessalonians. We've talked about different passages. I've talked a couple times. Chris has talked about different passages there. Super fast recap if you haven't been with us. Paul actually goes to this city. He plants this church. He's not able to stay there very long because people riot and run him out of town. He's concerned about them. He's concerned, do they stay faithful to Jesus? Do they turn back? Sort of what happens. He sends people back to report. They come back to Paul with a good report. He follows up with this letter. Okay, so that was the 10,000-foot view of 1 Thessalonians. So he takes on different topics, and it seems as though when he comes to 1 Thessalonians 4:13, where we jump in here, it seems as though there's some misunderstanding with the Thessalonians related to the resurrection, the idea of Jesus' resurrection and what that means. Now, again, before we sit back and pass too much judgment on them, Depending on exactly how long Paul's there and exactly how long the messengers stayed, these people have had very little biblical instruction. So some of the stuff that we sit back, especially if you've been in church, if you've been a believer for a good long time and you've studied some of this, we may sit back and say, hey, this is obvious, but to them it wasn't. So it seems as though, and we're going to read it in a minute, but it seems as though we've got a couple different issues going on. It seems as though some of them, they got the idea that Jesus is coming back, like we got that in our head, but then some Christians have started dying. And a question came up, what happened to them? Do they miss out on being with Jesus forever because they didn't survive? Or, how does that work? Do we ever see them again? And how is that going to work in some of their worldview, some of their Greco-Roman worldview? And it seems like that's one of the questions that Paul starts out with. So I want to start reading through. We're going to make some comments as we go and then try to sort of, again, zero it in on us as we apply it here at the end. Okay, we want to get hope from the resurrection. Resurrection gives us hope. Let's jump in 4:13. Paul writes here 4:13, he says, and now, dear brothers and sisters, we want you to know what will happen to believers who have died. And super fast pause, depending on what translation you're reading, some translations say asleep, and that's really literally what it says. That's a Greek euphemism for death. So it'd be sort of like us in English saying pass away. Okay, it's a little bit nicer than saying died. My translation just says died, but that's what we're talking about. Okay, so we're not talking about believers that are, bored in a sermon sleeping in the back pew, right? These people are dead, okay? Paul says, we don't want you to not know what will happen to believers who have died, so you will not grieve like people who have no hope. So Paul's saying, I'm going to help you understand what's happened to believers that died, but the goal in that is so you won't grieve like people that have no hope. Now, I think it's interesting, he doesn't say that you won't grieve, right? He said you won't grieve like people that have no hope. And there's a difference there. Think about John chapter 11. That's another passage I'd wanted to get to today, but it's probably outside the scope of what we're able to do. But John chapter 11 has the story of Lazarus' death, and it's got the really famous verse, Jesus wept. Right, that's in there. And a lot of people know that verse, and they're like, that's a real short verse, and that shows Jesus' humanity, and all of that is true. But think about that. You've got Jesus weeping at a funeral. Jesus is grieving. So we're not saying here that we don't grieve. We're not saying that we don't feel the effects of sin. That's not what Paul is saying, but I think where he's going to go with this is the doctrine of resurrection doesn't make us numb to the effects of sin. Okay, we still hurt from sin, and including physical death and suffering and all of the effects of sin in our world, but it gives us hope that Jesus is going to fix it. And I think that's where Paul's going. So Paul says here, so you're not going to grieve like those who have no hope. Verse 14, for since we believe that Jesus died, right, Jesus was really dead, and was raised to life again, Jesus was resurrected, we also believe that when Jesus returns, God will bring back with him the believers who have died. We tell you this directly from the Lord. We who are still living when the Lord returns will not meet him ahead of those who have died, for the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a commanding shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet call of God. First, the Christians who have died will rise from their graves. Then, together with them, we who are still alive and remain on earth will be caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Then we will be with the Lord forever. So encourage each other with these words. So he's going to end with that idea of encouragement. Now, we're going to go on in just a moment, and we're going to look at the first few verses here in chapter 5. But as we think about my main idea today, that the resurrection gives us hope, this is sort of the long-term hope. So I want to talk kind of about long-term hope, then in the here and now. So the resurrection does give us long-term hope. Long-term meaning there will be a day coming when Jesus returns. Jesus is coming back. Not maybe, Jesus is coming back. And when he comes back, this is what it's going to be like. Commanding shout and trumpet and voice, and all of that's going to happen. But the hope for us is that for you and for me and for other believers that have already died, Jesus is going to bring back those believers with him. And then if we're fortunate enough to live until Jesus comes back, which that's kind of the one I'm pulling for. I'd rather kind of skip the physical dying thing. I'm kind of cheering for that one, but it's in God's hands. If we live until Jesus comes back, we're with him too, and we get to be with the Lord forever. And resurrection, yes, involves the fact that my grandfather or your friend or whomever knew Jesus and died, Jesus undoes the effect of sin that includes their physical body dying, but they come back to a world where Jesus makes everything new. And again, think how different that is when we zoom out and see resurrection in the big picture. We're not saying that a believer dies and comes back in a new body and lifts up their head in a world full of sin. That would sort of be resurrection, but it's not resurrection like Paul's talking about it. Yes, we get a new body, but I rise in this new body in a world where no one's hungry, where no one's sick, where no one's fighting, where no one's stealing, where no one's murdering, where no one's lying, where there's no pain and no sadness and no fear. That's resurrection, and that's resurrection hope. And again, that's really good news, big picture. So, long-term hope. I think that's where Paul's going to go. Things like we will be reunited with believers who have already died. And that's a really cool thought when you start thinking about that. When you think about Bible characters, right? Jesus comes back and there's David. Jesus comes back and there's Moses and Peter and Daniel and Bible characters up there. I think that's cool. It's cool when you start thinking about figures from church history. I don't know if you have any favorites from church history. I don't know if you ever even looked at church history, but reformers or great, founding fathers, those kind of people are with him. Then I think this gets really, really personal, and I'm not trying to get emotional or weepy on you or anything like that, but this does touch on things like people that we have known that knew Jesus and died. We'll see him again. And what is awesome about that is we see them again, but we don't see them in the same way that we saw them here. We don't see them suffering, we see them in joy. We don't see them in sickness, we see them in perfect health. We don't see them afraid of the future. We see them in perfect confidence because we're with Jesus forever. So yes, resurrection brings hope. Yes, resurrection involves our bodies, but it's much bigger than that. So it's a long-term hope, which I think is really, really good news. There's a guy that's some of you are probably familiar with, a guy named Tim Keller, writes books, and he was preaching, and he used an illustration that I liked in terms of long-term hope and its effect on us now. Keller used the illustration of, imagine that you got a job and it was a really, really, really boring job. Now, this is sort of dangerous when I pick a job, and I don't know all of you because I'm going to pick your job and you're going to love it, and it's the one I'm criticizing as boring. So if that magically happens, don't get too mad at me, all right? Let's assume you have the most boring job in the world. Let's say you sit in a room, a small room with no windows, a very sad little boring room where everything is tan, okay? Most boring as possible, and you sit in there and your job is to take a bolt and put a nut on it and drop it in a bucket. Take another bolt and put a nut on it, drop it in a bucket, and that's what you do 8 hours a day. Would you have a lot of hope and joy and spring in your step when you went to work? Probably not, unless you just really get a kick out of that, unless you're super OCD and that's just your calling in life, and if that is, good. Having said that, Keller makes the point then, what if we change your hope at the end? What if I told you you're going to do that 8 hours a day for a work week, 40 hours, and at the end of 40 hours, I'm going to give you $1 million for that work? All of a sudden now you probably do have a spring in your step, and you're probably whistling on your way in, and you can't wait to put nuts on bolts, right? Because you have this hope at the end that it's going to be really, really good at the end, and that's going to motivate me. That may seem like a trivial illustration, but I think that is helpful. That's helpful as we look at our long-term hope. Okay, so the resurrection gives us hope. It's a long-term hope. It includes our physical resurrection, but it's bigger than that, okay? I want to read a few verses out of chapter 5 and talk about sort of our immediate hope, all right, from the resurrection, then we're going to apply it and wrap it up. So let's pick up here in chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1, let's read on. Okay, so Paul's given us the long-term hope. Verse 5 then. Paul says, now concerning how and when all of this will happen, and this here I think is the return of Christ that he's been touching on. Dear brothers and sisters, we don't really need to write to you. For you know quite well that the day of the Lord's return will come unexpectedly like a thief in the night, when people are saying everything is peaceful and secure, the disaster will fall on them as suddenly as a pregnant woman's labor pains begin, and there will be no escape. And you may say, wow, that doesn't sound hopeful at all. Well, okay, we get that Paul's talking about sort of the big picture world, if we can put it that way. People who aren't putting their hope in Jesus, people that haven't believed. And Paul's going to make that contrast next, right? Verse 4, Paul says, but you believers in Thessalonica, you are not in the dark about these things, dear brothers and sisters, and you won't be surprised when the day of the Lord comes like a thief. For you are all children of the light and of the day. We don't belong to darkness and night. So be on your guard, not asleep like the others. Stay alert, be clear-headed. Night is the time when people sleep and drinkers get drunk. But let us who live in the light be clear-headed, protected by the armor of faith and love, and wearing as our helmet the confidence of our salvation. And some of your translations actually use the word hope there again, the hope of our salvation. Then, Paul's going to give us gospel here in verse 9, 10, and 11. Paul says, for God chose to save us through our Lord Jesus Christ, not to pour out his anger on us. And that's good news. That's gospel there. Verse 10, Christ died for us so that whether we are dead or alive when he returns, we can live with him forever. Then again, he comes back to encouragement in verse 11, so encourage each other and build each other up just as you're already doing. Now you may say, okay, that still felt like long-term hope. How does that come into the here and now? Well, I think it's really, really significant to me that Paul goes into the nitty-gritty, right? He doesn't say, hey, I've got good news. Someday in some indefinite place way down the road, Jesus is going to come back. He's going to make everything new. That's awesome. So go sit on your hands on a park bench and wait for that to happen. Or your life may really stink until then, but you know what? There's really nothing you can do about it, so you just got to wait for the long-term thing to happen. No, Paul says this long-term good news is happening. Jesus will make everything new when he comes back. But then Paul says, here's how you're going to live. You're going to live in the here and now like a soldier. I mean, this is the illustration he uses. You've signed up and you're in the army, right? You've got a helmet on, right? The helmet is the hope of your salvation, but you are in the battle. This is an ongoing thing right now, is I think what Paul's going to say, and he's still tying that to resurrection. Now, later on, maybe in the next couple weeks, we'll actually look at some of the specifics, and if you want to just scan with your eyes down through, verses 12 through the end, he's going to sort of give a rapid-fire list of specifics. But Paul here, I think, is not only tied resurrection to the big picture, the long-term hope, but I think he's giving us hope in the here and now as we serve and as we, if I can sort of use the military imagery, fight for Jesus in the here and now. Now, you may think, okay, how is that tied to resurrection? How does that happen? Well, it's interesting, again, as I mentioned earlier, if we define resurrection a little bit more broadly, not simply my physical body coming back, although as we said earlier, that's part of it, but if we define it as Jesus making all things new, we get little foreshadowing or little foretastes or little previews of resurrection all around us. And you may say, well, what does that look like? That looks like when God, in his will, intervenes and heals somebody today. That's a little taste of resurrection right there. Because what we just had is we had the effect of sin on somebody, and God, in his providence, in his will, perhaps in response to the prayer of his people, breaks in and heals. That's a little taste of resurrection today. That's a little taste of Jesus making everything new. Think about your own conversion. That's a taste of resurrection. And Paul even puts it in those terms in Ephesians 2. Again, we don't have time to flip over there today, but if you want to do that now or do it later sometime this week, Paul says you were dead in your sin, and Jesus made you alive. That's a little taste of resurrection. Even though we're not perfect now, he's making us new. So we get these little tastes, we get these little pieces of resurrection in our life now that we should relish and enjoy and be encouraged by. The example here that I thought of, maybe again a cheesy example, but an example I thought of is that's and I'm not a great cook. I'm one of those cooks that I usually have 3 ingredients, and one of them is always meat, like some kind of meat, some kind of bread, and like a condiment, and that's a great meal right there. Done. So I'm not a great cook, but I do cook sometimes. And one of the things that I like to do, again, with my kids, is we make pizza. But when I say make pizza, I don't make the dough. If you make your own pizza dough, shout out to you. I tried that once. It was epically bad, okay? It ended up being like pizza toppings on a manhole cover is kind of what happened. It didn't go well. So I get the pre-made dough. So basically when I say cooking, really I'm talking about just dumping ingredients on a piece of bread, okay? Like pizza dough. Now, if you're thinking, what does that do with resurrection? Okay, the meal at the end is the pizza, right? And I'm a believer in more toppings the better, especially again if they're meat, that's the way to go. So a little is good, more is better. One of my kids, Andrew, I think is still in here. He likes cheese. We're still working on adding some meat to that. Here's my point though. One of the great things about making your own pizza is there's always a little bit of ingredients left over, right? So you got this pizza, you spread the sauce on, there's a little bit of sauce left. You're spreading the cheese, but hey, there's a little cheese left in the bag. So I wonder, what is Dad going to do with that? I don't know. I'm going to start tasting a little bit, right? Pepperoni, I'm spreading that out, and hey, there's a little pepperoni left. That's meat. That's good. It's fully cooked, I'm pretty sure, right? So what starts happening to some of the extra pepperoni? I'm gonna get a little foretaste, or I'm going to get a little sample of that while I'm waiting for the pizza to cook. Now, I'm not trying to trivialize resurrection and make it into a pizza, but sometimes I think we need to think about it that way. God, in his goodness, allows in his will resurrection to break through from time to time. And I think we need to rejoice in that. We need to rejoice in conversions. We need to rejoice in restored relationships in the here and now. We need to rejoice in healing. We need to rejoice in other things in life, financial provision, or really anything that would mirror or anticipate full resurrection or Jesus undoing all the effects of sin. We should rejoice when someone is provided for with a new job, right? We should rejoice when we see social change and people getting fed that are hungry and those type of things, because again, I think that's sort of like getting a little bit of the pizza topping early. We're getting little tastes of resurrection. And again, I think when we make that connection to the fact, wow, I knew this certain person, we prayed for them and God healed them, that is awesome, I'm happy. And wow, think of the day when everybody's going to be healed like that. Think how awesome that'll be. So I think what Paul does by taking resurrection and drawing it into the here and now gives us hope in the day-to-day, still linked to resurrection, still linked to this big idea, but he's showing that this breaks into the here and now. So resurrection gives us hope, both long-term and in the here and now. Okay, I've got a couple applications for you very quickly, and then we'll transition to a time of communion. Again, one more time, key idea is the resurrection gives us hope. A couple applications very quickly. Okay, so if we take this idea and we try to say, okay, what do we do with this idea this week? Well, I think our first step, as I often have, my first application, not always, but a lot of the time, is if what I've talked about today is just foreign to you, and you're like, okay, maybe I've heard of a guy named Jesus, and I'm kind of familiar with Easter, but I have no idea what this means. This is new to you, and you don't really understand this, and you're thinking, wow, he's talking about hope, and I really don't have that. If you've never trusted Jesus, if you've never really understood the resurrection and what that means, I'd love to talk with you, perhaps at the end, or I'm sure Pastor Chris would as well. We'd love to talk to you about that today. Because if you've not trusted Christ, then all of this resurrection hope that we're talking about is sort of something out there you can see, but not really tap into. So if this is something new to you, if you'd like to talk more about it, I'd love to do that. Okay, application number 2 then. Application number 2. I want to think long term, then I want to think short term with applications, and then I'll be done. Okay, long term. Long term. Application number 2. Take some time today or this week to think about Resurrection Day. Take some time this week to think about Resurrection Day. Now, I like to make lists. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're an art person. I'm not. I do stick figures, and that's about it. Maybe you'll draw a picture. Maybe you'll list stuff out. Maybe you'll just sit and think. However this works for you, find a quiet spot and think about Resurrection Day. Perhaps open up your Bible to this passage and read it. Read, okay, the Lord is going to descend from heaven with a shout, and draw a picture, or make a list, or just close your eyes and visualize that. Jesus coming back in the clouds in glory. Then with him, we've got those that have died are with him, and visualize that. Think then about, okay, I'm going to be with him and I'll be with him forever, and slowly sort of process this again one more time this week. And I think what you're going to find is that hope is going to happen. Okay? I don't think I have to say try hard to hope this week. I think what I can tell you is spend some time this week, focus on resurrection. Focus on the long term. Last application, I'm done. Okay, so first application, trust Jesus. If you want to talk about that, I'd love to. Second application, take some time this week to think about the Resurrection Day. Visualize that. Last application, I'm done. This is more for the here and now. Take some time this week and make an effort this week to try to see one glimpse of resurrection this week and acknowledge that. Try to find one glimpse of resurrection this week and acknowledge that. Try to find one way in which God in his mercy, God in his sovereignty, God in his providence intervenes in your life and the life of somebody around you and breaks in with his power and in a small way perhaps undoes some of the effect of sin. Maybe that's somebody that was sick that gets better. Maybe that's an unexpected financial blessing. Maybe that's you hearing of someone alleviating human suffering or whatever that may be. But try to make note of one this week and actually acknowledge that. Maybe acknowledge it to your spouse, or your kids, or just to yourself, and take some time and thank God for that. And again, I think the byproduct of that will be encouragement. You'll say, wow, God is really good that he did that.